Stop. Podium. Table. Table. Okay. Difference. 1, 2, 1, 2, stop. 1, 2, 1, 2, stop. Yeah.
Sounds so hollow. I didn't think nothing out of those.
I don't know.
Talk.
1, 2, 1, 2, stop. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Today is Monday. Today is Sunday. Today is Friday. What day is it? I don't know. Why? Well, never thought about it. So if it did not, 1, 2, test. Test, test, test. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, but you got to bring those mics closer to what's that? I think they're too far back.
And Sam and Joe and Eric
fun debate. Oh yeah, we certainly will. That one in our coverage will grab some stuff too.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the first annual Center for a New American Security public debate featuring the nation's best collegiate debate programs. Right off the bat, I want to tell you who I am. I'm Colin Kahl. I'm a professor at Georgetown University in the Security Studies program there. I'm also a senior fellow and program director at the Center for a New American Security, where I lead up our small but spunky Middle East team. We're sponsoring this event today along with the Civis Institute. So right off the bat, I'd like to thank Kevin Bertram of the Civis Institute for his kind financial support and his strong encouragement, without which this event would not be possible. Kevin is a huge supporter and an enthusiast about the importance of debate at all levels, and we could not have done this event without Kevin. So Kevin, thank you very much. I also want to thank the CNAS staff, and especially Catherine Cloud, for doing so much of the logistics to make this possible. Today's debate is on Iran. Obviously, the world's eyes are refocused on Iraq, which, despite only being one letter different from Iran, is apparently an entirely different country. But even though all eyes are focused on the turmoil in Iraq, we are also, I think, approaching a possible inflection point as it relates to the slow-motion, decades-long nuclear crisis with Iran. Last November, Iran and the so-called P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, negotiated an interim nuclear accord that basically froze Iran's nuclear program in place to enable additional diplomatic talks to reach a long-term, enduring, comprehensive solution. The agreement went into effect in January. The deadline for reaching a comprehensive agreement is July 20th, which is fast approaching. There are a lot of complex issues to overcome. The parties are still fairly far apart on a number of issues. It's possible that the agreement could be extended for a number of months after July 20th. And obviously, I think the vast majority of people hope that there will be a peaceful diplomatic resolution to one of the world's greatest international security challenges. But it's also possible that diplomacy could fail. And I think that it's imperative that we have a conversation, a national conversation, about what the United States and the international community should do. What's Plan B in the event that diplomacy fails? It's not obvious what Plan B is or should be. By the way, I'm opening my phone right now because my iPad battery just died, and I have the judges' bios and everything on my phone. So I'm not checking Twitter or text messaging. I'm actually this is actual work. Who are these guys? I was a high school debater and a college debater. It was a formative experience for me. In fact, I think it was the most important training for me to both be a policy wonk and a policy maker. And I debated at the University of Michigan, and now I am a professor at Georgetown University. It just happened that the two programs in the final round of the National Debate Tournament this year were Georgetown University and the University of Michigan. So I thought it would be a great way to kick off a deeper engagement with the debate community for us to invite those two programs to Washington. Yesterday we had some meetings at the White House and at the Pentagon. We had the students join us for our annual conference on Wednesday with, along with 1,200 of our closest friends also here at the Willard. You know, it's been a great couple days, I hope. The resolution that they will be debating is resolved. Here, let me get the exact wording. Resolved that the United States should use military force against Iran's nuclear program if diplomacy fails. Affirming that resolution, that is supporting that proposition, is the University of Michigan, right over here, actually. Kyle Deming, the guy with the beard, and Alex Pappas from the University of Michigan, and they are coached by Colin Kahl. Aaron, where are you? Back there. Negating the resolution, so opposing the proposition, is Georgetown University, the two Andrews, Andrew Arsht and Andrew Markoff. And they are coached by Jonathan Paul. Jonathan, where are you? Yep, there we go. Let me just say one brief aside about the nature of competitive debate. One of the best things about the nature of competitive debate is that it forces you to make arguments to win debates that you may or may not believe. And I'm a firm believer that the road to objectivity, impartiality, and pragmatism is the ability to walk a mile in the other side's shoes. And one of the best ways to do that is to force yourself to make arguments that you may not believe in as vigorously as possible. So I say that as a caveat because I think it's perfectly likely that all four of these guys will make arguments and make them passionately and persuasively that they may or may not personally believe. The point of this is not to have a bunch of advocates up here, but you know, so you shouldn't ascribe. If you're listening back in Tehran, and you're a member of the Revolutionary Guard, don't blame anybody for anything. The idea is to have a fair airing of both sides of the issue, and I expect that that's what we're going to have today. We also have an esteemed judging panel joining us today, and all of whom are former debaters who have gone on to be very successful in the policy universe in one way or another. The first is, just going to go in alphabetical order, is Jay Finch. Jay, would you kind of raise your hand? He's hiding behind the pillar here. Jay has spent a career working at the Pentagon and is now the Principal Director for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He's focused on a whole range of WMD proliferation issues to include the Syrian chemical weapons issue and nuclear nonproliferation issues. Jay was a very successful college debater at the University of Kentucky where he and his teammates did extraordinarily well, and then went on to coach at George Washington University as a debate coach for a while before entering the policy universe. Next up is Michael Gottlieb. Mike Gottlieb over here. Mike Gottlieb began debating at Lawrence High School in Kansas, and then at Northwestern University, where he was a two-time national champion. So he did pretty well, I guess. He is currently a partner at the firm of is it Boyes? Yeah. Boyes, Schiller, and Flexner. He joined the firm following 5 years of government service, including time as a federal prosecutor, over a year as the senior civilian on an interagency rule of law and development task force in Afghanistan, and several years in President Obama's White House counselor's office. Next up is Alex Lennon. Alex, will you raise your hand here? Alex was also a national debate champion from Harvard University back in 1990. So the University of Michigan made the final rounds of the national debate tournament this year. It's the first time Michigan has made the final round of the national debate tournament since I was at the University of Michigan, which is awesome. The thing that's not awesome is these guys were born after I graduated from the University of Michigan. So anyway, Alex and I were peers roughly. Alex won the National Debate Championship in 1990 for Harvard University. He's also founded a program that's similar to what CNAS would like to do to link up the debate community with another think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Currently, Alex used to work at the State Department on Middle East issues, and now is the managing editor, runs the show for the Washington Quarterly, which is one of the nation's leading foreign policy journals. And he's been doing that for a long time. It was housed at CSIS for a while, and now it's housed at George Washington University. Alex, thanks for being here. Next up is Biz Zarepko, over here. Biz Zarepko graduated and debated for Michigan State University. She won't hold it against the Michigan guys, where she won the College National Debate Championship as well. She also coached debate at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Michigan State University, and the University of Michigan, but they haven't paid her for a long time, so I don't think she's in the bag for the Michigan guys. Biza holds a master's degree in public policy and environmental science from the University of Michigan, and she is currently an assistant director in the International Affairs and Trade at the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. I should say for people like both Biza and Jay, I'm obliged to say that they're here in their individual capacity, and nothing that they say or do reflects the official position of the U.S. government in any way, or their organization, or anything, really. Yes, all right. Last but not least, I want to introduce Erin Simpson over here. Along with Michael, she debated in high school in Kansas, but Erin reminds me that unlike her good friend Michael, her parents refused to pay for her to go to Northwestern University, so she didn't debate in college. She did get her PhD at Harvard, so she ended up okay. And one of her best friends there was a national debate champion, so she can never escape the nerd orbit that is the debate universe. And currently, Erin Simpson, who is a specialist in intelligence and irregular warfare, is the CEO of Karas Associates, which is one of the most highly regarded research and strategy firms in Washington, D.C., so I think she ended up okay, too. All right, let me just tell you a little bit of the format. There will be 4 constructive speeches. Each one will be 7 minutes long, followed by a cross-examination. Each one of them will be followed by a cross-examination period of 3 minutes. The affirmative will start, then the negative will go, they'll alternate. Then there will be 4 rebuttals, this again alternating. They'll be 5 minutes long, and the negative will start. So with that, I'm going to sit down, and I will be your timer. I'm going to sit right there. I'll hold up things. My iPhone will probably have this really annoying siren that goes off when you reach your time limits. So with that, the affirmative.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Colin Kahl and the Center for New American Security for helping to put this together and providing a lot of help and support. I also want to thank the Civis Institute and Kevin Bertram as well for his support, as well as the judges for coming in this morning, and our opponents for providing what will be a great debate. So, good luck. The question of whether the United States should use military force against Iran's nuclear program if diplomacy fails is both timely and highly relevant. Significance is in part due to the disastrous consequences that a nuclear-armed Iran augurs for the Middle East and for the globe. While it's clear that a successful diplomatic option is preferable, the failure of diplomacy raises 2 choices: acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran, or take action to avert otherwise disastrous regional and global consequences. Understanding Iran's motivations for nuclear acquisition and clearly outlining its intentions is a precursor to understanding the costs of nuclear proliferation and devising solutions in response. According to Matthew Koenig, Associate Professor of IR at Georgetown, the Iranian government as a whole, and Supreme Leader Khomeini in particular, have overseen a vast buildup in nuclear infrastructure. This has occurred in spite of widespread international condemnation and its associated costs. The Iranian leadership has clearly calculated that the benefits of deterring a foreign attack and becoming the most dominant state in the Middle East overwhelm the costs of international hostility. Acquisition would yield benefits in terms of prestige, increasing the likelihood of the regime retaining its grip on power. These justifications make the pursuit of nuclear weapons justifiable from the perspective of those governing Iran. Upon the failure of diplomacy, Iran could dash to a nuclear weapons breakout capability in just 2 to 12 months. While the risks of military action are considerable, the consequences of diplomatic action are too grave to bear. As such, the United States should conduct surgical strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities following the failure of diplomatic negotiations. The risks of failed diplomacy include bipolar or multipolar nuclear arrangements that are prone to instability, miscalculation, and escalation. Bipolar nuclear competition generates pressure from both sides to execute a preemptive or preventative first strike. Eric Edelman, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, explains that fearing Israel's quantitative and qualitative nuclear advantages may force the Iranian leadership to face a use them or lose them dilemma and respond by attacking first. Israeli leadership is similarly willing to execute such a strike, as demonstrated by Israel's attacks against Egypt in 1956 and 1967, against Iraq's nuclear program in 1981, and a suspected Syrian nuclear site in 2007. On the one occasion that Israel absorbed the first blow in 1973, it came perilously close to defeat. In short, the early stages of an Iranian-Israeli nuclear competition would be unstable. The failure of diplomatic talks may independently force Israeli desperation as Iran crosses red lines and the United States looks like it isn't going to attack. Israel's historical track record and its view of Iran as an existential threat generate a very real possibility that it'll strike independent of the United States' action. In fact, in the event that the United States doesn't strike, Israel will, but with considerably less efficacy. Anthony Cordesman, former Director of Intelligence Assessment at OSD, elaborates. The United States would be the only country that has the air power, the support capability, and the mix of sea and air forces in the Gulf to continue a sustained campaign and restrike after an initial battle damage assessment is found that further strikes are required. The risks of an ineffective strike by Israel are compounded by the possibility of a multipolar nuclear arrangement due to cascading regional proliferation to hedge against a nuclear Iran. As Major General Amos Yadlin noted at the CNAS conference on June 11th, if Iran develops the bomb, Saudi Arabia is next. The historical and geopolitical rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia means Riyadh would face tremendous pressure to respond to a nuclear-armed Iran. Riyadh may choose to accelerate its nuclear program in response to failed diplomacy, exploiting Pakistan as a means of nuclear acquisition. These multipolar systems are less stable, as coalitions can shift quickly, upsetting the balance of power and creating incentives for an attack. Edelman continues, emerging nuclear powers might not invest in expensive survival capabilities, such as hardened missile silos or submarine-based nuclear forces. Given this likely vulnerability, the close proximity of states in the Middle East, and the very short flight times of ballistic missiles, any new nuclear powers might be compelled to launch on warning. Diplomatic breakdown also carries consequences in terms of the overall standing of the United States. Iran is the supreme test of American credibility in world affairs. After repeatedly decrying Iran's attempted acquisition of nuclear weapons, allowing Iran to develop a bomb or maintain a breakout capability would demonstrate the ineffectiveness of the United States foreign policy. It would be a devastating blow to American prestige. The consequences are significant, extending far beyond regional conflagration. A nuclear Iran would have the ability to coerce regional players who control 75% of global oil reserves, negatively impacting the stability of energy markets. A nuclear Iran would be a more active sponsor of international terror. Its terrorist infrastructure ranges globally, from Latin America to Asia, and its glowing long-range missiles capabilities pose a threat to allies on a global scale. The best means of managing these consequences is a surgical strike. These strikes should be carried out with an attempt at limiting collateral damage and immediate pullback of force so that Iran would be responsible for escalating the conflict. Strikes on the Isfahan uranium conversion site, the Qom and Natanz uranium conversion facilities, enrichment facilities, and the Iraq plutonium heavy water reactor facility would create a choke point. Without these, it would be impossible for Iran to make nuclear weapons. Surgical strikes against critical Iranian sites would knock their capability back by 5 to 10 years or more, leaving them without the ability to dash for a bomb, providing incentives for them to abandon their program altogether or to return to negotiations, and staving off the threat of regional nuclear proliferation. These strikes would be primarily air power based with no boots on the ground. These are feasible given the superiority of the United States armed forces. The Isfahan and Iraq facilities are easily susceptible to air assault. While Qom and Natanz are buried under rocks and mountains, repeated strikes by massive ordnance penetrators would effectively destroy them. Iranian air defenses are obsolete and vulnerable to advanced U.S. standoff capabilities. At worst, the entire attack would take a few days. Collateral damage would be limited, but the results of the strike would be profound. The Iranian program would be reduced to rubble. The historical record of regional nuclear aspirants like Iraq and Syria provides evidence that Iran would be likely to give up its program if strikes proved decisive. Iran would have invested years of effort, massive amounts of human capital, and millions of dollars with nothing to show for it. Even if Iran resuscitated its program, its rebuilding efforts would rely on materials and equipment difficult to obtain in the aftermath of a strike. Thank you very much.
All right, Kyle. So the first thing I want to talk about is when you talk about the possibility of an Israeli attack.
Yes.
And one thing you quote Anthony Korsman in saying that the Israeli attack would fail because there couldn't be a restrike. What does that mean?
So, for example, if the United States had to bomb the Fordow site near Qom and use a massive ordnance penetrator, the site is buried under like 295 feet of rock.
Okay.
So a single attack might not work, but a second attack after an initial damage assessment was done might be necessary.
Well,
only the United States has the supply munitions, the equipment required to conduct an effective second strike, and Iran couldn't retaliate to.
That makes a lot of sense, but then at the very end of the speech you just gave, you say that we should only attack once and then create a choke point and cut that off.
I mean, yes, over a period of 1 to 2 days.
Okay, so restrike means striking
over a
few
relatively
times
short
over the
period of
course
time.
A few hours?
Yes, these are the capabilities that only the United States possesses.
You start your speech by saying that Iran's goal has clearly been demonstrated to be regional hegemony, parity, or at least parity, and the ability to coerce Israel as well as other regional rivals. And then you say that there are 3 mechanisms through which a strike could convince Iran to give up its weapons, either delay, which actually doesn't really seem like it would convince them to do anything, that they would abandon the program, or that they would be willing to return to negotiations. That seems incommensurate with your argument that they are hell-bent on nuclear acquisition.
Well, just because they're committed to regional hegemony doesn't mean that they have to do it with nuclear weapons. We are saying that Iran will probably dislike us no matter what we do. However, we say that they would be substantially less dangerous without nuclear weapons. And they could be convinced if they invested millions, billions of dollars and human capital into an effort that produced absolutely nothing, that they would probably be more likely to pursue other less dangerous means of screwing with us in the Middle East.
By that you mean abandoning their nuclear effort entirely?
We think that the strike would cause them to abandon their nuclear effort, yes.
You say that Iran would become a quote-unquote more active sponsor of international terrorism if they were to acquire a nuclear capability. That means that they would give nuclear weapons to some, like
it also applies to conventional terrorism. Because Iran would be protected under essentially its own nuclear umbrella, they could conduct conventional strikes without fearing retaliation as much, at least in their mind. Obviously, this brings a whole bunch of risks of escalation, but that's not something that we think Iran can predict perfectly.
Okay, and to be clear, you said the timeline is 2 to 12 months. That seems somewhat disparate. 2 months and 12 months are extremely different. Can you give me like a more accurate?
I unfortunately do not have access to the most classified information available to the United States government, so I can only go on what's available on public source. Okay. That is wide, but we know that Iran has the ability to dash for a bomb and acquire necessary enriched uranium for one.
And it could either happen in September or next year.
That's why a strike is so necessary.
Well, before I begin, I'd like to echo the, eloquent thanks that Michigan gave to CNAS, the Civis Institute, specifically Professor Kahl and Mr. Bertram, the distinguished panel. We're very lucky to have you, all of the guests today, and Michigan, who I'm happy to consider very good friends. This is a lot of fun and an honor, so thank you. And then I'll begin. Our thesis is quite straightforward, namely that military action in the Middle East against Iran is exactly the wrong way to preserve peace in the region going forward. There are 3 main reasons. First, a strike would not end the Iranian nuclear program. Quite the opposite. An American strike would exacerbate the risk that Iran crosses the nuclear threshold going forward. Second, an American strike is the most likely catalyst for renewed conventional violence across the region and continued escalation. And third, Iran's nuclear program, even in the absence of diplomacy, is not quite as dangerous as our opponents claim. In fact, Iran's leaders are rational, Israel is unlikely to start a war over the issue at the present time, and the US can use containment methods, many already in place, to prevent escalatory instability. A strike would not guarantee an end to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Iran has multiple declared facilities and has acquired a large reservoir of nuclear knowledge. It has also shown a willingness to spend enormous resources on nuclear science. A strike, as Dr. Kahl himself writes, would lead Iran to distance itself from the IAEA and perhaps to pull out of the NPT. This would make future multilateral pressure on Iran impossible. It would also undermine the international inspection regime that has been so valuable in keeping track of Iran's progress to date. It's where they get their data. And it would make Iran's nuclear program opaque, fueling even greater anxiety among its regional allies and foes. Domestic politics in Iran would contribute even further to this dynamic. Rouhani and other moderates have slowly gained power in recent years, which has made these negotiations possible. Should the US attack Iran's nuclear program, which our opponents have already stipulated is the key point of pride for both the regime and their people, hardliners will have a trump card to wrest back control of the government. The result would be more bellicose leadership in Tehran, whose focus would be to restore the country's prestige via a weapon. Our opponents rely heavily on the idea of limited strikes that target only the nuclear program, which would theoretically put the onus on Iran to respond. Yet, any campaign against Iran on this issue is unlikely to stay limited. It's common knowledge that Khamenei considers the nuclear program a key national interest. Iran's leaders have hedged their domestic legitimacy on maintaining the nuclear program in the face of outside pressure. Simply acquiescing to a strike on their nuclear facilities would be domestic political suicide. It would throw the entire revolutionary ideology and the basic premise of the Republic into question. Weighed against the risk of regime collapse, retaliation is practically guaranteed. Khamenei's back would be to the proverbial wall. Dr. Kahl writes again, Iran would presume Israeli complicity in an attack. Hezbollah would initiate counterattacks, and as 2006 shows, Israel is willing to strike back against these sorts of provocations. As you all know well, Bashar al-Assad faces a very precarious situation in Syria, to say the least. He would be only too happy to deflect attention from his continued troubles at home by backing a popular conflict with Israel with an easy justification provided by us and our military. Any Israeli involvement, of course, would create added pressure for the US to redouble its commitment. This just a few hours and then wash our hands concept that was established in cross-examination is a fantasy. In the aftermath of a strike, Iran could fear the worst and strike the Strait of Hormuz before the US could clearly establish its aims. Iran has been building anti-access and aerial denial capabilities specifically to challenge US naval superiority in the Gulf. Many of these platforms are controlled by the Revolutionary Guard, which itself is not always under the command of civilian leadership. If traffic in Hormuz were disrupted, even temporarily, the global economy would suffer greatly. Knowing this, of course, US military commanders might also feel pressure to hit Iran's conventional forces in a broader preemptive move. But of course, in their first affirmative constructive, our opponents have precluded that possibility by so narrowly curtailing the scope of their aims. While a nuclear Iran is far from ideal, it would not be catastrophic. If Iran decided to militarize its program, today's inspection regime would provide adequate advance warning. It would be possible to retighten the sanctions regime almost instantaneously, putting Iran's economy back in dire straits. This would give the US a year to reassure allies, many of whom already possess strong American security guarantees. And this would prevent any wave of regional proliferation. After all, Israel's nuclear program produced no cascade dynamic. And as Stephen Walt argues, China, North Korea, and South Africa all should raise questions in our minds about the validity of domino theory. Our opponents make two other claims. First is that Iran could use nuclear weapons to provoke other countries, especially by providing them to surrogates. This defies common sense. Building a bomb is costly and dangerous, as Kenneth Waltz writes. It would make little sense to transfer the product of that investment to parties that can't be trusted or managed. Second, our opponents claim that Israel would strike if we did not. This is a scare tactic. They would not pull the trigger without the green light from the United States. Even with adequate technology, Iranian nuclear infrastructure has been built specifically to withstand precisely such an Israeli attack, with modern Russian air defense protecting a dispersed network of enrichment plants. Iran is ready. Israel would not strike if they could not succeed. At a time when the risk of chronic overstretch is already hemming in U.S. strategic options on all sides, adding another sustained engagement to our military's mission could put key tasks at risk in this and other theaters. The risks of a strike outweigh the benefits. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess to start, there were several points in your speech where you noted that regime survival was sort of the goal of the government, which makes a certain amount of sense. If that's the case, then why would Iran, in response to a strike, shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which would close off its only major source of income, oil, and would guarantee the entire weight of an international coalition to reopen it?
Well, that is a possibility, but not in the world that was constructed in your first speech, right? The debate over motivation.
The debate over motivation we think is important because it throws into stark contrast this idea that they would seek out a weapon and destabilize the region in the status quo without exception.
Okay,
but
just
then
to
after a
clarify,
strike,
though, we
after
agree
a
that
strike,
Iran...
they would, give it all up, right? Like the question of regime survival is so tied up in the nuclear issue now that your problem that you state in the first speech and your solution to it are motivationally at odds from the perspective of the regime.
I'm not sure how any of that proves that Iran would commit suicide by closing the Strait of Hormuz. We agree that they're rational.
Yeah,
Our entire speech was based on that premise.
I guess in the aftermath of a strike, the question of closing Hormuz being the only risk that the regime would consider to their continued stability is absurd.
Okay. So you note that Israel wouldn't strike on its own because it's ineffective, which we agree with, and an assertion that they would need the green light to do it. When has that ever stopped them? They struck Iraq's reactor in 1981. They struck Syria's in 2007, both without a U.S. green light. Why are they waiting on us?
I think I can speak to those historic examples specifically. In 81, the Iran-Iraq war was going on, and all of Iraq's strategic bombers that could have retaliated against Israel in the western portion of the country had already been destroyed in an airstrike. They had commandos on the ground to disable all air defenses, and the guards who were monitoring the radar systems
So just to clarify,
were
it is
literally
an
out to
question.
lunch that day.
Okay. So it is an effectiveness question. Fair enough. You argue that in response to a strike, Iran would redouble their efforts to gain a nuclear weapon. Given that I'm not sure how you contest that Iran is going after a nuclear weapons capability, at least a virtual deterrent now, why would it be worse after a strike?
Regardless of whether or not they would pursue breakout now, they definitely would after a preemptive action.
But they already are doing it. What does redoubling their efforts even mean?
It means increasing funding, and there's a big difference between the potential for breakout and breakout.
Okay.
Well, before I begin, I'd also like to echo the thanks in the first two speeches. I won't repeat all of it to belabor the point, but I'm sincerely grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Kevin Bertram. Thank you to CNAS and the judges. So with that, I will begin. The position advanced by the negative drastically underestimates the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran and is akin to playing Russian roulette with the Middle East and with the globe. The negative holds out hope that the current strategies of diplomacy, of containment, and of the sanctions regime may work, but ignores that the resolution of today's debate calls for what we should do when those solutions have failed. The negative simply asks that you acquiesce to a nuclear Iran in this world. It is our belief that this position is both misguided and dangerous. Given this sobering reality, we contend that a limited surgical strike is the best available option. First, I will address their arguments about the ineffectiveness of a strike. First, they speak to the value of international inspectors, yet that ignores that those inspectors are no longer useful in a world in which Iran has crossed substantial red lines of 90% uranium enrichment or already kicked out those inspectors, which is the contingency in which we would strike to begin with. The second point is that those inspectors, according to many expert accounts, are retained solely to create the perception of a peaceful nuclear program, and little suggests that that incentive would meaningfully change after the United States has struck. Yes, Iran has a substantial reservoir of nuclear knowledge, but a military strike would certainly induce caution on behalf of those in the Iranian nuclear establishment and possibly deter them altogether. Now, the claim that Iran would redouble its nuclear efforts is wrong. It assumes that Iran isn't already committed to building a nuclear weapon, which was the point that Kyle was getting to in Cross-Ex. It also assumes that we simply couldn't mow the grass later and attack once again to prevent Iran from further nuclear proliferation. Next, I will address the negatives claims about conventional violence in the region that are resulting from a strike. Radical responses by Iran are unlikely, and the consequences of conventional retaliation in no way compare to the consequences of an Iran with nuclear weapons. While it is rational for Iran to strike back with some degree of force, it will fall short of outright conflict as the disparity in military power between the United States and Iran is so great. Iran has zero incentive to wage a war it knows it can't win. Not to mention a carefully calibrated strategy on behalf of the United States could restrain Iran as well as Israel from engaging in preemptive action. These assurances include establishing red lines for retaliation upon which Iran would face the full force and strength of the United States military. This would serve to effectively deter large-scale retaliation and ensure that the United States sticks their back up against the wall rather than them feeling that their back is up against the wall to begin with. The United States could communicate with Israel, ensuring that it is willing to absorb some retaliation and prevent its involvement in this conflict. Something similar happened in the 1991 Gulf War and demonstrates the effectiveness of this strategy. Syria also has little incentive to engage in a diversionary conflict. It is currently engaged in its own internal troubles, and according to Matt Koenig, won't be looking to take on additional military obligations. Next, I will address their argument about the Strait of Hormuz. That would be wildly out of character for an Iranian regime. It would result in the immediate sinking of its navy, nearly universal international backlash, and a loss in oil revenue which accounts for 80% of government revenue, the lifeblood of its very economy. Iran's prioritization of regime survival, as they themselves have conceded, makes these retaliation options suicidal and unacceptable from the perspective of the Iranian regime. Finally, let us take note, we are not warmongers or heavily armed doves as was used in the conference the other day. We are merely advocating a limited strike and not a full-blown military incursion. Now, don't be fooled by the negative short-sighted optimism. It is important to remember the disastrous consequences that a nuclear-armed Iran has for the region and for the globe. They have not contested the prospect of accidental or inadvertent nuclear use, which is increasingly likely, and given the dynamics of the Middle East of short flight times, as well as the close proximity of states in the Middle East, these risks are especially acute. The claim that Iran isn't pursuing nuclear weapons lacks any substantiation. They are going full-blown ahead in the status quo, developing ICBMs, heavy water reactors, which can only be used for uranium enrichment, as well as increasing levels of uranium enrichment currently. Future underground facilities could be destroyed given the existence of the massive ordnance penetrator. If any of you have seen the video for that, the destructive potential of this thing is really, really massive. Yes, regional proliferation hasn't occurred in the past, but the sample size of nuclear history, do we think that's a cause for optimism? According to Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard writing in the 2010 issue of Foreign Affairs, the Middle East is unique in its ability to generate a proliferation cascade, with Saudi Arabia publicly stating its intention to pursue a nuclear weapons path from Pakistan, which the first negative constructive has not at all responded to. Security guarantees are by no means universal and have no mechanism for rolling back the Iranian nuclear program, nor do those security guarantees solve increased Iranian subversion in the region via an increase in support for proxies. While Iran might not furnish a complete bomb to terrorist groups, it may provide nuclear knowledge to other states such as Venezuela. The AQ Khan network in Pakistan demonstrates that the spread of nuclear know-how is indeed quite likely. And Iran, feeling emboldened, may step up terrorist attacks in the region via proxies. The costs of supporting nuclear terror are much easier to bear once Iran has a newfound source of international leverage. Finally, the negative has failed to respond to our arguments about the credibility of the United States in the international arena and the deleterious effect on international energy markets, which is something they simply have not rebutted. The impact is widespread, and it diminishes the ability of the United States to support the liberal international order and secure peace in many regions of the globe. Finally, the negative has poorly refuted our claims about the likelihood of an Israel strike. All of us are in agreement that that strike would be ineffective. The point is that a United States strike avoids the problems of an otherwise inevitable strike by Israel, which simply lacks the military capability to do so. The cross-examination raised the question of particular historical instances, but that ignores the overwhelming historical trend on behalf of the Israeli Defense Forces and those in Israel about the likelihood of the military threat. In conclusion, this debate poses you with two choices. One is acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran and accept the catastrophic consequences, or two, engage in a much-needed limited military incursion.
So in your speech, you make the claim that Iran would be deterred from lashing out because they fear the superiority of U.S. air and naval capabilities in the region. If that is the case, since they are obviously aware of the possibility of a surgical strike in the status quo, why wouldn't that same logic deter them from breaking out in the first place?
Well, the point is that Iran is hell-bent on acquiring nuclear weapons in the status quo for reasons of international prestige, and they have determined that it's in their security interests, irrespective of deterrence, to acquire them. The current deterrence capabilities cannot roll back the program in a way that meaningfully curtails its development.
I guess I don't quite understand that, but I'll rephrase in a slightly different context. If the reason why Iran would not attack the Strait of Hormuz in the aftermath of a strike is because they value their own economic incentives and international credibility to avoid doing so, which is what you said in your last speech, then by that same logic, both the logic of economic self-interest and energy markets, why haven't they folded to the current sanctions regime?
The reason they haven't folded to the current sanctions regime is for the very reason that they have continuously been pursuing nuclear weapons currently. So the status quo disproves your theoretical analysis of the situation, which is only applicable in a scenario planning situation about the likelihood of what would happen as a result of a surgical strike. The U.S. using force is something that raises the cost and dramatically changes the game of what occurs in the region, and makes it so that they don't want large-scale military retaliation or a harm to their economy, but they are pursuing nuclear weapons for reasons that are independent. So there's a difference in scope that your question doesn't deal with.
Alex, those answers make sense. It just seems like they rely on the premise that Iran has a single contained set of motivations that apply to nuclear acquisition, and then a completely distinct set of motivations that they apply to all other circumstance. But I have another question. Namely, what is the mechanism by which Iran would be exercising this deleterious influence on international energy markets after nuclear acquisition?
Our evidence speaks to the prospect that an Iran feeling emboldened because it possesses a nuclear weapon would be increasingly likely to talk to other Gulf states and producers of oil and coerce them into changing the way they distribute oil, how much, and at what cost, in a means that raises and creates a risk premium in global oil markets of between $20 to $30 a barrel, which has the same economic consequences as you've referenced by the Strait of Hormuz.
I understand, I guess, that connection. I'm wondering why the reimposition of status quo sanctions, which have cut them off from international oil markets, wouldn't similarly address that risk and incentive structure.
Well, that presumes that the question of today's debate is about the effectiveness of diplomacy, but the question of the resolution is if diplomacy fails, which you have not rebutted.
Just quickly, thank you to everyone who's already been discussed. I don't want to echo that and spend more time there, but we really appreciate everything that the Civis Institute and CNAS and Colin and Kevin have done. And this week has been fantastic, and Michigan, you all are the greatest, and we're happy to always get a chance to debate you, even though the actual season's over. Okay. Michigan's core argument rests on a major logical contradiction, and it undermines the entire efficacy of their proposal. They argue that Iran is irrational enough to give away a nuclear weapon, one of the hallmarks of their regime's legitimacy, to a terrorist group, and irrational enough to risk retaliation from Israel by ramping up its bellicose foreign policy. They also argue that Iran, in a bid to protect its simple self-interest, would not risk a regional war. This is a clear contradiction. We believe, by contrast, that Iran is fundamentally a rational actor. Reformists like Rouhani and Zarif have breathing room to make changes, and the survival and legitimacy of the regime comes before all else. The only thing that could drive Iran to simultaneously intensify its nuclear program and become more bellicose in the region would be striking at the very heart of the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. Our opponents assume that the only way for the regime to come under threat would be from a failure to build nuclear weapons, or at least that's how they perceive it. And we argue instead that being seen as insufficiently aggressive in the face of a US strike would undermine the core message of the supreme leader, which is, I can fight back against the United States for our right to enrich. The result of a surgical strike would likely be conflagration. Iran would feel the need to fight back, largely for the same reason our opponents claim they feel the need to be an actor in the region now. The nuclear issue is a key interest, important for the legitimacy of the regime. Our opponents make arguments that they have no incentive to wage war, that we could create red lines or limited strikes. We should be highly skeptical of this argument. In the fog of war, there are not ways to communicate these red lines. How could we negotiate with them when those aren't necessarily open, something that Colin or Dr. Kahl himself writes about? And in the instance where the Iranian regime has its back to the wall, why would they be willing to negotiate? They make an important argument. There's no incentive for Iran to wage a war that it can't win. But then why build nuclear weapons in the first place, which seems to, what would be the end game? Giving them to terrorists would invite the same retaliation. And it proves this logical contradiction at the heart of Michigan's argument. They say that Israel wouldn't get involved because the US could reassure them. However, our argument is not that Israel would choose to get involved in a low-level action, but rather, if the United States were to take military action against Iran, Iran could easily place the blame onto Israel, encouraging follow-on strikes from Assad and from other regional actors, because Israel is seen as an enemy in the region. Iran itself would ratchet up instability. And at a time of US rebalancing and strategic shifts, we shouldn't take a risk of a failed strike. Alex makes a big deal in his last speech about how a failure of US diplomacy and to take a strong stand after that would make the US look weak on the international system. A failed strike would do the same, and regional conflagration would almost certainly have the same effect. There are a few things I think are important. They say that the US could reassure Israel, preventing them from getting drawn in. I think that largely proves our leverage over the Israelis and the ability to prevent them from striking preemptively against US interests. Also, they say that the Iranians would not commit economic suicide, which I think proves something that they didn't address, that a retightening of sanctions and removing the executive waivers that we've used to give them breathing room under the temporary agreement would be a sufficient way to deter Iran from pursuing a nuclear capability. Now, let's talk about the actual consequences of Iranian nuclear program. While not ideal, they are not catastrophic. They say inadvertent nuclear use. This is an odd claim. Iran, if they can't wage wars or won't wage wars they can't win, seem unlikely to start a nuclear conflict with Israel. It takes time. We'll know if Iran is breaking out. The only chance that we won't somewhere in that 2 to 12 month window, provide some capacity for response, whether it's tightening sanctions or stepping up diplomatic pressure or reassuring our allies. But the only way that we couldn't know if Iran was going to nuclearize would be if they were to move that program underground, something that Michigan has not done a great job of addressing, which is an opaque program, one in which they move their nuclear facilities to undeclared ones, not able to be overseen by the IAEA, would be a far more likely scenario for a breakout that we can't anticipate. It would prevent the reapplication of sanctions, containment, etc. They say that we could transfer nuclear know-how, or that Iran could transfer nuclear know-how. I think this is perhaps something that is inevitable. To a place like Venezuela, this was a relatively underdeveloped argument. But unless we were to undermine all Iranian nuclear knowledge, I think my partner will speak as to why that's impossible and logically doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's no way to stop that transfer. But we shouldn't worry about the effects on the region. Iran is focused on its core interests, not shutting down their economy, as they say, or preemptively causing a war with Israel. A strike would change that calculation by putting the regime's legitimacy on the line, but we should be skeptical that an Iran with nuclear weapons would change substantially from an Iran now, which is, although aggressive, not suicidal. They wouldn't hand off nuclear weapons to terrorists. They can't control the outcome of what Hezbollah would do with them, and they would be caught by US surveillance or nuclear forensics in the event of an attack. There wouldn't be a regional wave of proliferation. History should be a cause for optimism here. Israel created a nuclear capacity in the 1960s, and since, not a single country has declared one. China was the last major nuclear program to develop, and since then the pace has slowed to nearly a snail's pace. The Saudis, as well as Turkey and Egypt, can all rely on the US and value the US relationship. They say that the credibility of the United States is on the line, but a failed strike would be just as bad, as I've already explained. And they say that Israel would strike instead of us. This inevitability argument is a scare tactic that I think we've heard since the Bush administration. If we don't take action, Israel would. You should be skeptical. They not only don't have the motive because they value their relationship with the United States, and the United States could convince them, just as we could theoretically convince them not to engage in a limited strike, we could convince them not to go ahead without us. And they also don't have the means. Iran is prepared with Russian air defense systems, and something that they said is extremely important. The US has categorically refused to sell Iran the MOP, the massive ordnance penetrator, which is the only way to carry out a successful attack. Knowing that they couldn't do so, it seems unlikely that they would take that risk.
So you mentioned the fog of war and the prospect for communications breakdown as a reason conventional conflict is likely. My question is, why does that similarly not apply in the context of an Iran with nuclear weapons? And why isn't that much, much worse than a conventional conflict in which that same breakdown were to occur?
Well, we think that the reason Iran has a nuclear program, regardless of whether it's civilian or military, is not to start preemptive wars.
So your claim is just that Iran will never use the nuclear weapon,
which
is premised on rationality, where the fog of war and communications breakdown presumes that that is no longer true because of conflict occurring.
We may be talking about rationality in two different ways. Iran is a rational state in that it values the survival of its regime and ideology. Mm-hmm. In the context of a war, a US preemptive strike, it becomes very difficult to open up phone lines with the Iranian leadership and say, don't worry, we're only going after a few nuclear centrifuges. Okay. We're not going to also take out the Revolutionary Guard stations in the Gulf.
A separate question, how do you deal with the ability for Iran to be a virtual proliferant, or the fact that it could turn the screw relatively quickly on the ability to create a nuclear weapon?
I'm confused. Do you mean the 2 to 12 month
Yes, so argument? How do you prevent that 2 to 12 month window from still existing in a world absent a strike?
Well, one, I mean, it's on the further end of that. And I think that's something we've been clear about, that it's uncertain how long that would take, but to build an ICBM capability to outfit weapons and to enrich to 90% would take a long time. Tightening of sanctions would create domestic political dynamics that would prevent Iran from pursuing a nuclear capability that could be deleterious to the international system. And even if they were to build a nuclear weapon, our argument is that that would not be as catastrophic as the risk that we create a new Middle East conflagration.
Waiving executive waivers and not releasing funds, ending them. Why would that not cause a breakdown of diplomacy and ensure that they continue a path towards nuclearization?
Why would that not cause a break?
Yeah, so you said we should tighten sanctions.
Right,
Clearly,
I think we've all
diplomatic
agreed.
negotiations would have failed. What is the basis for the efficacy of further sanctions in a world in which diplomacy is broken down?
The reason why the Iranians, I mean, I think a large part of the reason why the Iranians have come to the table in the first place and fully suspended nuclear operations in these negotiations is because of economic pressure and the way that's affected internal political dynamics.
I see. Okay.
Whether that restarts negotiations, changes the political scene, creates a stall, we think that's more effective than an ineffective strike.
The time elapses. You said Israel had no incentive to strike Iran. Clearly, they've made statements that they view Iran as an existential threat to their security. One nuclear weapon could collapse the whole Israeli state. Why do they not have an incentive to attack Iran?
I mean, those public statements I think we've been hearing for years and years and years, and across multiple red lines and years, et cetera, it's never happened.
This is the point where things shift from constructive to rebuttal, which means the sequencing of the speeches also switches. So that's why the negative team is speaking twice in a row. These speeches are now 5 minutes. There will be no cross-examination between them, and we start with yet another answer.
My speech will primarily focus on the likelihood of Iran reconstituting their program in the aftermath of a strike, because we think that this is important and that it undermines the entirety of the affirmative's aim. The likelihood of Iran reconstituting the program in the aftermath of a strike is significant, it's feasible, and it's devastating. We've been down this road before. In 1981, the Israeli Air Force executed a surgical strike against the nuclear reactor south of Baghdad. Far from ending Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, the operation caused the Iraqi dictator to redouble his efforts. Funding and personnel for the program increased, but Iraq did not declare its replacement nuclear facilities to the international community, which is the whole point of our NPT argument that I'll get to later. But by 1989, Iraq was closer to a nuclear weapon than they had been prior to the strike. That's not a Goldilocks delay. That is a resurgent nuclear ambition. Now you might be thinking, that delay matters. It was almost a decade. It might have been worth the Israelis' while. But the reason that Saddam Hussein was unable to quickly refurbish his entire nuclear apparatus was the ongoing costly war he was waging against Iran throughout the 1980s. By the way, against US support. In fact, an Iranian airstrike on Iraq's long-range bombers was the only reason that they didn't retaliate against Israel in the first place. So it also doesn't disprove our Middle East war claims. History should serve as our guide, but we think that the rally the flag effect would be worse in the case of Iran than it has been in past instances. Our opponents have conceded that hardliners would take over the day-to-day affairs of the regime in the aftermath of a strike. Individuals within Iran who now support negotiations and restraint would have no political ground left to stand on. Any argument that they advance about the regime possessing insufficient resources to rebuild after a strike contradicts their original justification for having a strike, which is premised on the idea that the regime prioritizes breakout capabilities above and beyond any economic self-interest. Otherwise, sanctions would have worked. The risk of pullout from the IAEA inspection apparatus and the NPT is significant and went under-addressed. Pullout would decrease oversight capabilities, it would make inspections and verification impossible, and it would shatter our ability to keep allies from establishing their own deterrent, because they would have no way of evaluating the veracity of our intelligence claims. Let me explain what Alex means when he says mow the grass. In this analogy, Iran's nuclear ambitions are the grass, and US strikes are the lawnmower. Of course, assuming Iran's ambitions to break out will inexorably grow like your Kentucky bluegrass is designed to make a strike seem more reasonable, which is precisely why this kind of inevitability argument is so insidious. It's also a confusing mixed metaphor, since at this point in the debate you might be trying to figure out what it means to play Russian roulette with your lawn, which I wouldn't recommend. Any chance that Iran rebuilds the program, which is the point of this argument, defeats the original purpose of a strike, because each time a breakout capability reared its head in any suspicious form, because we couldn't verify, we'd have to strike again and again and again. Any decision to hold back and allow that reactor to go forward, even if it was a civilian low-grade reactor, would wreck U.S. credibility, which gets back to their arguments about the inevitable collapse of U.S. relationships in the region, by making us seem hypocritical and bellicose for initiating military action in the first place that overcommitted us going forward. The necessity of repeat strikes also entails all of the same strategic risks as a containment strategy, but with fewer benefits, because we would need to maintain a strike force in the vicinity of Iran into perpetuity, with the attendant massive investment of resources to preclude air defenses, to preclude access denial, to preclude retaliation. That is a regional war. For all of these reasons, we think that surgical strikes are ill-advised. And one last thing, this transfer of nuclear know-how that they've identified, it's a risk, but that is not what keeps countries from going nuclear. The difficulty of enrichment is, which is why we're having this debate in the first place. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Three framing questions decisively favor the affirmative in this debate. First, every scenario of Iranian mischief is inevitably worse with nuclear weapons. Terrorism, regional confrontations, the drive for hegemony, Iran will always be opposed to us. They'll probably dislike us after a strike. But any instance in which Iran could use a nuclear weapon is drastically worse in comparison. Even a tiny risk of a nuclear war in comparison to a conventional conflict far outweighs whatever marginal risk of an Iranian fit is thrown after a strike. Second, an Israeli strike will guarantee all of the consequences without any of the benefits. I think that Georgetown is wrong about Israel. They have a historical motive, there is evidence that they're likely to strike, and they opposed Iran as an existential issue. They would only attack them if it were clear that Iran has passed red lines and that it was likely that Iran would gain a nuclear weapon. It's likely they've attacked Syria in 2007. Even if it's true that they took advantage of Iraqi weakness in 1981, it's more likely that they'll take advantage of any moment of Iranian weakness in 2014. Third, diplomacy fails. That is the framing question for the entire debate. We've already exhausted all available options. Iran will be driving for a nuclear weapon. They'll have a nuclear weapon within 2 to 6 to 12 months. It is a last resort, but a strike is the best of all available options. Now, our opponents began by saying that we assert that Iran is irrational, that regime control or stability is their central concern. We agree. That's why it's such a problem. The reason why deterrence dynamics are likely to break down is because an Iran with nuclear weapons will be faced with use-or-lose dynamics where they have vulnerable ballistic missiles faced with Israeli conventional retaliation. They wouldn't be able to invest, because they simply don't have the money, in expensive survival capabilities like SSBNs. They don't have the technology to ensure that they have a survivable second strike capability, so they will be forced to be aggressive, and Israel in retaliation. That's also why other countries are likely to proliferate in response. They assert that the United States would be seen as aggressive and that Iran would take advantage of this. After a strike, I think that Iran would actually probably retaliate, of course. They'd be likely to try to shore up domestic support, but if anything occurred, it would be a conventional ballistic missile strike on Israel, increased terrorism, regional harassment. This compares nothing like a nuclear attack or miscalculation or accidental war. They assert that Syria would follow on. I think this is laughable. Bashar al-Assad is not going to convince the rebels to drop their weapons and turn on Israel after everything that's happened in the last several years. Israel is not likely to respond in overwhelming force if they know that they can simply absorb an Iranian conventional attack in exchange for them having no nuclear weapons. Again, it's a central concern of the Israeli state. They assert that a strike would cause Iran to have an opaque nuclear program, that it would be harder for us in comparison to track them. Whatever. If Iran's program is reduced to rubble, who cares how opaque it is? In comparison, Iran would be a decade away from a nuclear weapon. They haven't really contested the efficacy of any of those strikes by massive ordnance penetrators. They would have no path to a bomb for a decade or more. So the international coalition that might get around us in response will be able to deal with the consequences as a result. They assert that there will be no domino proliferation. We disagree. History is actually on our side. When China acquired a nuclear weapon, India's response with the Smiling Buddha test in 1974 and Pakistan's response to the nuclear test in 1998 were direct responses to security concerns that arose because of nuclear weapons. Now, the second negative speech argued that Iran will reconstitute their program. The central overall issue, though, is that Iran is already going for a nuclear weapon. I don't know whether that Georgetown is reading Iranian news sources and has fallen for their propaganda, but it's pretty obvious that Iran doesn't need 50,000 second-generation centrifuges in order to power a medical reactor or deal with research and development. So, an Iranian bomb is inevitable. It's simply a question of whether we can head it off, delay it for decades, and eventually convince them to give up their program. I actually think Georgetown doesn't deal with the question of Iran giving up its nuclear program very well. If they were faced with investing millions of dollars in human capital in an effort that provided no particular benefit, a rational Iran would be likely to give up its program in response because they know that they get nothing from upsetting the international order. Domestically, the Iranian doves are probably already going to lose power as a result of the failure of diplomacy. A strike is simply an attempt to deal with an already hostile Iran to prevent scenarios from being even worse.
So we're in the home stretch. There are just two final speeches, and then what will happen is the judges will exit the room and go deliberate for a little while. I'll talk to you all a little bit about how some of the issues raised in the debate speak to the broader debate that's going on in Washington about Iran policy and how some of the issues that maybe weren't raised in the debate should be considered as well. And then we'll have an opportunity while the judges continue to deliberate for you all to ask some questions of the debaters as well. So that's where we're going from here. But so about 3 more minutes of prep time for George.
we've been kicking around a whole lot of ideas here today, and I think at the end, one thing we know for sure is that the Middle East is unstable. It's worried about Iran. It's worried about Iraq, regional instability. How can the U.S. do the least harm possible and prevent an accelerated crisis in the region? The least bad option is not to strike. Certainly, the best option is not striking. They don't really address that there is no such thing as a so-called surgical strike in the Iranian context. There's no way to keep it limited, to effectively communicate our red lines to them. The Iranian nuclear program is a key issue for the legitimacy of the regime. So regardless of whether Iran is rational or irrational, when the entire basis of the Islamic Republic is on the line, when their back is to the proverbial wall, Iran will fight back. If they don't fight back directly in the Strait of Hormuz, they'll scapegoat Israel, as they've done multiple times in the past. They'll ramp up support for Hezbollah. They'll find other ways, non-conventional ways, to escalate the situation. A new Middle East conflict is exactly the wrong thing for the U.S. to be drawn in at this time, of strategic rebalancing to Asia, of U.S. credibility stretched thin. Every argument they've made for why that conflict would be bad is a reason not to strike. They have a few framing arguments. Iranian mischief would be worse with nukes. This is wildly inconsistent with a large part of Alex's first speech, where he said that Iran isn't suicidal. If they aren't suicidal, what is the end game of giving a nuclear weapon to Hezbollah? To sell a nuclear weapon to terrorists, which could not only be detected, but prevents Iran from controlling it, controlling the use of those weapons, makes no sense. If, on the contrast, Iran is irrational or suicidal or committed to undermining the U.S. and Israel at all costs, then I think that proves our argument that strikes wouldn't work, that they would likely reconstitute their program in an effort to undermine the United States and Israel at all costs. They say Israel would strike if we don't. You know this is a scare tactic. It's a scare tactic that's been used by hawks for years and years, saying an Israeli strike is coming, it is right around the corner, but it hasn't materialized. It seems far less likely to materialize now, with the Israelis, who we can all agree are quite rational and calculating, knowing that they cannot hit deeply buried Iranian centrifuges at places like Qom because they do not have the same weapons. The massive ordnance penetrator that we've explicitly refused to sell them couldn't be employed by Israel. Why would they strike if they would fail? They say diplomacy fails. Strikes are even worse. Iran has a motive to reconstitute, and if they were embarrassed by a U.S. strike in the first place, it would be the best way to save face. Any way you conceive of Iranian motivations, this is true. They say they could reduce to rubble. While this sounds nice as a catchphrase, you can't kill each scientist, and you can't take Iranian money. 1981 proves that an underground effort, like Saddam's effort after the Israeli strike against his nuclear facility, is far more likely to be accelerated and secret from the international system. Mowing the grass, which my partner spent a lot of time talking about, is bad. We'd be at permanent war with Iran, containing them every time they threaten to break out. And that is far more likely to collapse the credibility of United States policy, foreign policy, because the moment an administration emerges that chooses not to continue down that path, suddenly we look like we're not committed. They say that there would be a wave of regional proliferation. Putting aside the examples of China and India and Pakistan, which have been debated by IR scholars for decades, Israel acquired nuclear weapons in the 1960s without triggering a wave of regional proliferation. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, all have access to U.S. security guarantees, potential U.S. security guarantees, the NATO umbrella in the case of Turkey. We should be highly skeptical that they'll throw those relationships out the window and choose to nuclearize against U.S. will. Finally, they make this appeal to maybe your emotions. Iran is getting a nuclear weapon. What can we do about it? First, this is also somewhat of a scare tactic. There's really no conclusive evidence that anyone in Iran has made the call to nuclearize their capability. 2 to 12 months, we think it's on the longer side to acquire a functional ICBM system and equip nuclear warheads. And containment, as well as reassurance of our allies and retightening of sanctions, could all shift that timeline, allowing for some other way to prevent the Iranian nuclear program that doesn't create a wider conflagration in the Middle East.
Oh, 37. Where's Colin? Is the... Okay. Well. The best the negative has provided you is, quote, some other way. What is that some other way the negative has provided you? The question of today's debate is what should happen once diplomacy has already failed. They have said there should be a sanctions regime, a regime of containment. Those are all existing parts of our current diplomatic strategy. The resolution is phrased solely in the conditional sense and not what we should do tomorrow. Our claim is not that Obama should attack Iran after Sunday brunch, but that he should do so after every other option has been exhausted. We agree with Obama's stated policy of keeping all options on the table. The first negative argument is that there's an accelerated crisis in the Middle East. Yes, an accelerated crisis in the Middle East is likely. It is likely inevitable. The question is that conflict conventional, or is that a conflict that involves nuclear weapons? Only the affirmative accesses a conflict that has the potential for the use of a nuclear weapon, which is an impact that is categorically distinct from a few Scud missiles being used in Israel, however regrettable that may be. Their second claim is that a strike will not remain limited. That ignores the fact that no boots on the ground are required. There are 4 facilities, as well as possibly a few more if the generals determine it tactically necessary, that would be attacked, and the scope of Iranian retaliation would remain limited. They have made the claim that there's no communication channels. They have recently been opened in the course of negotiations, and through presidential speeches and other means of communication, we could communicate to the Iranians the cost of any continued retaliation. Now, their claim of retaliation, what is worse? Limited retaliation in a conventional sense, in which they step up proxies for Hezbollah or other terrorist groups, which they are already doing, or them doing so feeling emboldened by a nuclear weapon. Our claim isn't that they'll give a nuclear weapon to the next person they see again after Sunday brunch. Our claim is that they will feel emboldened by the possession of a nuclear weapon, and they will be increasingly likely to step up support for proxies in the region, which has deleterious conventional consequences as well. Their next argument about credibility. Security guarantees depend upon credibility, which only exists in a world in which Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. If there is a breakdown of one of Obama's central themes of his foreign policy, what signal does that send to our allies? Can they continue to trust us? What is the efficacy of said security guarantees? They have said they won't provide nuclear weapons to Hezbollah. I've answered that argument already about the prospect of an Iran emboldened by nuclear weapons and the increasing likelihood of that particular conflict. They have said a strike won't work. They haven't contested that it's technologically feasible. They haven't contested that only the United States can do it, and the fact that Israel would likely do it otherwise. It would deter the scientists, it would eviscerate their nuclear know-how in the region, and it would cause a scattering of the resources necessary to reconstitute a program in the first place. Israel is by no means a scare tactic. There's a robust historical basis for the claim that Israel would strike, and diplomacy is working currently. Our claim is that Israel would strike upon the failure of diplomacy because there's simply no other solution. Again, the negative ended with something else may work. What is that something else? What does Israel think is the alternative solution? A strike by Israel causes all of the same catastrophic consequences with none of the benefits of an Israel strike. The example of 1981 is not a settled historical debate. It forced Saddam to pursue uranium enrichment as opposed to plutonium, and all we know is that Iraq doesn't have a nuclear weapon today, which is all that matters. Not to mention that strike happened in 1981, it's 2014, and the strike was conducted by Israel and not the United States. Mowing the grass in no way results in a permanent war because they have not answered the efficacy of the initial strike. If the initial strike works, there's no need for a permanent war footing. 1-2 days, we wipe our hands, we're done, there's no more Iranian nuclear program. Finally, I will answer their claim about the failure of domino proliferation. They have not answered the claim that Saudi Arabia would proliferate in the region. There are public statements by Saudi officials, as well as stated desires to seek a nuclear weapon from Pakistan, which is the means by which they would acquire nuclear weapons, and they have not contested any of the evidence for the likelihood of a bipolar or a multipolar nuclear arrangement. History is little cause for optimism. There's, a couple decades of nuclear history, but that is not worth gambling over the future of humanity in a context of nuclear exchange. Again, the question is conventional conflict or a conflict that potentially involves nuclear weapons. As citizens, as people, we have an obligation to preserve the most lives for the most people. Thank you.
All right, at this juncture, you guys, I think we have some space reserved for you out here. It is currently 10:25. I think you're going to come back around 11, or you can come back sooner if you want, but that's what we have you on the agenda. At this stage, at this point, I'll say a few words up here. And we have somebody who wants to take the mic for when we have questions. Great. Well, thanks to the debaters for a lively and spirited exchange, which actually I think captures a lot of the debate that has been raging for years now, really, about whether if all other measures fail to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, the military option should be employed or not. Let me just mention, I think, a handful of issues that I think the debate captured pretty well that reflects the way in which this issue is debated in Washington. I mean, obviously, there's this question of whether Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons at all. Of course, the Iranians claim that they're not. But then there's an open question of if they're not, why have they spent $100 billion to build an infrastructure that looks like it's completely inappropriate for a civilian nuclear program, but quite adequate for a military program? If they're pursuing these capabilities, there's the question of why. Is Iran a kind of reasonable, rational status quo state, albeit one that supports militancy and subversion and terrorism as a means of foreign policy? Or are they irrational, or at the very least an offensively minded expansionist revolutionary state? How you answer that question fundamentally determines in part how dangerous you think a nuclear armed Iran would be. And frankly, very smart people about Iran don't agree about which of those are. Are they a defensive status quo state that seeks nuclear capabilities for deterrence because they fear us or fear the Israelis, or do they seek it for prestige and influence and other issues? If diplomacy fails, and the president has said most recently in West Point that all options remain on the table, he's said repeatedly that except for the one option, which is containment, which he's taken off the table, and he's strongly voiced that diplomacy is by far his preference and that they're going to go all out to get a deal. But the question is, if diplomacy failed, would a military strike meaningfully set back the program? There's a debate among military and defense professionals about that. I think there's general agreement that an Israeli strike would be less effective than an American strike, but there's real disagreement about how effective an American strike would be as well. Last and not least, I think what the debate illustrates, regardless of who you think won or lost on arguments or what you're persuaded for because maybe perhaps what you believed coming in, both these outcomes suck. I mean, they're both awful worlds. A world in which you have the possibility of a conventional conflagration in a region that's already hemorrhaging in every possible way as a result of an Israeli or U.S. military strike on Iran's program. Awful. Terrible. The history of warfare suggests that it's impossible to predict how that will end up. You can get started, but where it ends is impossible to predict. Awful. A world in which we don't strike or nobody strikes, and Iran decides that they have, with impunity that they can acquire nuclear weapons, also not a great place, right? So the point of having this debate was not to, signal to anybody that we should do this or shouldn't do this, but to say that both of these outcomes are awful outcomes. And in fact, the solution is, the resolution rigged the game, right? It said, if diplomacy fails, what should plan B be? But part of the goal of doing that is to suggest that plan B is awful. So we should make plan A work, right? And plan A is diplomacy, and it raises the question of how likely a diplomatic outcome is to be achieved. There's some good news and bad news on this front, right? I think the good news is that there is a leadership in Iran that is empowered by the election that was held last year, and at least for the moment empowered by the Supreme Leader to explore the possibility of a nuclear compromise with the United States and the rest of the international community that would preserve elements of the Iranian program, but assure the international community that it was for peaceful purposes in exchange for lifting economic sanctions. We've made more progress in the last 6 months on the nuclear issue than has been made in the last 10 years on the nuclear issue. That's real hope. On the other hand, the sides remain very far apart on a number of core issues. All right? The Americans insist that the practical needs of Iran's program are very small and can be met with just a handful of centrifuges, maybe 2,000, 3,000 centrifuges. The Iranians insist that the practical needs of their civilian nuclear program require 50 to 100,000 centrifuges. So while there might be general agreement that you need to limit the size, there's a pretty big gulf or gap between 3,000 and 50,000. Can those be overcome? The Iranians want massive sanctions relief, and they want it right up front for a deal. The Americans and others are more likely to try to meter out sanctions relief based on benchmarks for performance. Can you close the gap on that issue? There's a major investigation into the possible military dimensions of Iran's past nuclear research the IAEA is leading up to. The Iranians, we don't know the full extent of what they did, at least prior to 2003 and possibly designing a nuclear warhead, but we want to know. And the Iranians deny that they ever did any of this stuff, and they don't want to admit that they did it either. So can you overcome that divide? There's a heavy water reactor at Arak that needs to be modified so it doesn't produce weapons-grade plutonium. Can we find a compromise in that area? So these are all the areas in which you have to find some agreement between Iran and the United States and our negotiating partners. So this is a really important moment to have a national conversation and to make sure that we do everything possible to get a diplomatic outcome, not because I'm a hawk or a dove or you should be a hawk or a dove, but because I think the alternatives are worse. That even if you don't like the Iranian regime, and I suspect there's good reason not to, it's that old adage, it's the worst option except for every other option. And pursuing diplomacy to the full hilt, in my view at least, is the worst option except for every other option, which is either it being confronted with this terrible choice about acquiescing to Iran creeping closer to a nuclear weapon or perhaps starting another war. The last point I would make, and I think this is actually an issue that the debaters didn't raise that it might have been interesting to explore in greater depth, is actually not completely obvious, at least to me, that if diplomacy collapses, that Iran would immediately resume a rush towards the brink of nuclear weapons. The reason being that the Iranian regime may calculate that very much depends on how diplomacy collapses, not just whether it collapses. If diplomacy is seen as collapsing and Iran can portray it to the world as collapsing because the Americans and the rest of the international community was unreasonable, that is, Iran was reasonable, they were willing to make all these compromises, and it was the Americans and their allies who were making all these unreasonable demands. If diplomacy collapses for that reason and Iran wins that narrative struggle, then I think the Iranians might calculate that plan B for a while might be to not massively accelerate their nuclear program, but instead blame the Americans and try to undermine the isolation of Iran and the sanctions regime, and just kind of stay quiet on the nuclear issue and try to undermine the isolation infrastructure that's around them now. That's quite conceivable. And the reason why that might have been relevant to this debate is it's not obvious, especially if you're the negative team, it's not obvious that the collapse of diplomacy never necessarily drives the Iranians closer to a bomb. They might have a different plan B to deal with. The last point I would make on that is how diplomacy fails, if it fails, matters a lot for the military question as well, because there's a scenario in which the United States or anybody else takes military action in which the international community believes that we have some legitimacy and are justified in doing it because we tried everything that we could to prevent the program. We slid across a deal that was an amazing compromise for the Iranians, and they walked away from the table. If a strike happened in that context, it would have a lot more legitimacy the day of, and in the days and days after, the United States would be much more likely, I think, to be able to marshal a coalition to keep Iran from reconstituting its program. But if you flip the script, and suddenly diplomacy collapses and we're seen as the ones to blame, and then military action takes place in that context, then the prospect for shattering the international coalition and keeping Iran in the box in the days and days after a strike are highly problematic. And in that regard, I think a lot was talked about the Osirak strike. I will say General Amos Yadlin right there, back here, was the former head of Israeli military intelligence. He was one of the pilots in that strike, by the way. So he knows a little bit about this. But whatever one views about whether the strike was ultimately effective or not, there were three wars around Iran's WMD program, or three military actions. There was the 1981 strike, there was the 1991 Gulf War, and there was the 2003 war. Arguably, none of those wars ended Iraq's program, sorry. What ended Iraq's program was the 1981 and 1991 strikes, followed by 10 years of sanctions, inspections, and other things in the 1990s, which required an enormous international coalition. So it matters, if you're going to ever take military action, how you go into the conflict as much as whether you engage in the conflict at all. So with that, why don't we take some time to ask some questions. And I should say, when the judges come back, they'll render their decision. Just like the debaters are making arguments, some of which they believe and some of which they may not, the judges' opinions reflect who they thought did the better debating, not necessarily what they believe is right or wrong in this particular equation. So with that, do we have any questions for the debaters from the audience? Sir. And if you could say very briefly who you are and ask a question.
Hi, Colin. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Remember a number of years ago, Jacques Chirac asked the EU what was more dangerous, a unilateral U.S. strike on Iran or a nuclear-armed Iran. And the Europeans' reaction was that the U.S. strike was more dangerous. I would have been interested to hear the debaters' assessment of the reaction of our traditional Western European partners and our Middle Eastern allies to a strike.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe I'll ask the Georgetown folks because the Michigan debaters made a claim initially, right, that unless we strike Iran, having made pledges over 3 administrations, it will destroy U.S. credibility. Well, there's also the possibility that us launching a war that our closest allies don't like can undermine our credibility in other ways. So I wonder to the Georgetown folks if you have anything to add to that.
Absolutely. So I guess when preparing for these debates, specifically Iran, but also more broadly of the military genre, we find that the notion of credibility and our relationships with various powers are notoriously slippery concepts and difficult to get our heads around, differentiate, as well as disaggregate from one another. So, for instance, you heard Michigan invoke the notion of credibility being disrupted by the mere existence of a bomb because of the failure of status quo efforts. Presumably, the Europeans would fall into that catch-all, namely that they would consider that a less desirable international system. But, the specific question that you're referencing, when phrased as an either or, I think gets us into the same research traps as perhaps Professor Kahl was referencing with this particular resolution, namely that the debate format is fantastic for comparing and contrasting two sets of competing and potentially mutually exclusive claims, but has some weaknesses for maybe coming to a better understanding at the library end of things. Does that make sense? So I guess as a debater, I like that either or question because it forces them into a box. As a researcher, I would be far more enticed by the follow-up question of, what are your stated reasons for that preference when presented with the either or, and, to what extent do those preferences get shaped by the conversation that occurs between you and the United States leading up to military action.
And this is actually where I think, with the point I was making earlier, how you get into this mess actually matters quite a lot. I mean, so first of all, there's no, as you know, there's no one European view. There are hawks and doves within the European Union. The French, for example, are quite hawkish. The British are closer to the French position, but, and the Germans are further away, and there are others, I think in a world where the United States was seen as going full out to get a diplomatic deal and sliding across an extraordinarily generous offer to the Iranians that they turned away, and then the Americans took military action in that context, you probably wouldn't get cheers from every quarter of Europe, but you would probably get key countries like the Brits and the French and others, supporting us politically and potentially operationally in some ways. In a world where it's the opposite equation, right, where we put maximalist demands on the table that were unreasonable in the eyes of Europe and the world, and diplomacy collapsed that way, and then we struck on the back end of that, then I think you'd likely have a lot more discord within Europe about that decision. The last thing I will say, though, is if anything has taught us something we should learn since 9/11 is that the world, including our closest allies, are perfectly capable of complaining about everything and its opposite. That the Americans take too much muscular leadership, wield the military instrument too willy-nilly and unilaterally, Iraq during the Bush years, for example, or are too reluctant to do so in the face of global challenges, even when the international community doesn't agree in places like Syria today. So my guess is they'd complain no matter what we do. Josh. Wait for the mic.
I guess my question is for both Professor Kahl and the debaters. For over the past decade, I've worked with companies in trying to comply with international sanctions regimes, with Iran at the heart of these. And over the last few years, the growing convergence of sanctions with the UK and other entities has changed the climate for the energy sector internationally. What implications does a failure in diplomacy have, do you think, the ability to maintain a coherent multilateral sanctions regime, which seems to have changed the debate over recent years? And similarly, outside of the failure of diplomacy, for someone who has special insight into the region, Professor Kahl, do you think that the multilateral nature of the regime over the last few years has changed the way sanctions are felt inside Iraq, and what would the implications be if this gets further politicized in the United States? And we've seen some debate over Congress making a few moves here and there to try to expand the sanctions legislatively, and how does that play into the overall dynamic of either diplomacy or the existing sanctions regime?
Do any of the debaters want to take a shot at that before I chime in? Because I can talk about anything.
Sure. I'll just briefly add that I think whether or not the diplomatic process can be resuscitated probably plays a big part in whether the sanctions kind of stick together. So whether Iran were able to effectively wait out the countries that are part of that multilateral regime plays a huge part. What the state of the economy is, and whether certain countries can take some of the deprivation of the oil market that's going on as a result of the sanctions. So if the sanctions lead to something conclusive, you're more likely to see coherence and adherence. But if there's a sense that Iran has more bargaining power and can walk away for longer, I think, yeah, that the sanctions will probably have some difficulty staying together.
So I think there's a real question about there's some things I can predict, I think, fairly comfortably in a world where diplomacy fails, and that is that the Congress will pass new sanctions. that they will be unilateral, but they will be extraterritorial. The Menendez-Kirk legislation that nearly passed after the Joint Plan of Action, the interim nuclear agreement, would have tried to drive a substantial portion of remaining Iranian oil off the market. For those of you who don't follow this on a daily basis, basically the way that the United States and other powers constrict Iranian sales to the market is that, well, the Europeans have an oil embargo, and the Americans threaten to sanction any entity that purchases Iranian oil. Now those sanctions can be waived as long as you reduce your purchases of Iranian oil over time. And that was, the goal of that was to basically reduce the shock to the market and also the shock to some of our closest allies like South Korea or Japan or Turkey or important states like India and China who are massive consumers of Iranian oil. Okay, so I have no doubt that the Congress will go crazy. I mean, I don't mean that in an insane way. I just mean they will be rabidly committed to increasing sanctions in a world where diplomacy fails. By the way, the administration has signaled they would also support an increase of sanctions. The question would be, will that actually increase the economic pressure on Iran? And there, it becomes very difficult to predict. Because on the one hand, I think a lot of people are very worried about the Treasury Department. I think what you've seen, there are a lot of, some modest economic relief was promised to the Iranians in the interim nuclear deal, and some of that hasn't materialized because of how nervous banks are to do transactions with Iran and how nervous businesses are to do transactions with Iran. And by the way, for the last 5 months, anybody who's stepped out of line with sanctions has been slapped with fines in the millions and billions of dollars by the U.S. Treasury Department. So if you're a compliance guy, you're going to be very hesitant about creeping back into the Iranian market for fear of the Treasury Department. So that's an argument for, basically fear would allow the United States to drive the sanctions pressure up if diplomacy fails. But on the other side of that equation would be a general sense of, did diplomacy fail because it's our fault or Iran's fault? If it's our fault, then people are going to be less inclined to follow the sanctions, all else being equal. If it's Iran's fault, they'll be more likely to follow sanctions. I think one of the things the Obama administration deserves a lot of credit for is that they changed the global narrative about who's intransigent on diplomacy and reframed it as the Iranians are intransigent rather than us. But I will say, Rouhani and Zarif have started to change that narrative back. And so there's a point at which if we're blamed for the failure of diplomacy, the political willingness to go along with sanctions among powerful countries could decline. And then it creates a very difficult choice for countries like India, China, and elsewhere. Because let me just give you the India example. India is a major consumer of Iranian oil. They have driven down their consumption quite a bit, but they still, if you're going to drive the rest of Iran's oil off the market, India's going to have to stop importing a lot of oil from them. Well, most of India's refineries are calibrated to deal with Iranian oil. It's not cost-free for them to switch to other actors. In fact, it would be extraordinarily costly. So if you're in India, you're like, okay, well, what's the probability that the Treasury Department is actually going to go after our companies and risk a major trade war with a major country? And what are the costs of complying with this thing? And so I think there is an argument that in some ways we might be at peak sanctions. And that it might be more difficult to dial up sanctions pressure than we might otherwise think. And if the Iranians believe that and diplomacy fails, that's why Plan B might be to try to start then driving wedges into the sanctions regime instead of kind of rushing towards a nuke. But in the back there, sir. In the back all the way.
Sir, given the confusion that all this has created, isn't it time for Russia, China, India, who has had serious problems with American behavior for all these years, and given what Martin Luther King has once said in the 60s, that America is a prolific purveyor of violence in the world, it is time to probably say to the United States by these countries, Russia, China, India, that if you use a military option in Iran, we're going to use a military option against you. And it's high time you negotiate peacefully rather than use military option.
Anybody want to take a bite at that apple?
I think that's something that to some extent, not that we would agree with, but that the cost of a strike would be quite high. I don't know if it would mean outside retaliation against the United States. That seems a difficult scenario to envision, just given how tightly connected we are with those other countries you mentioned and sort of the general state of the global economy. It wouldn't make a lot of sense, I think, for a conflict over Iran to become a global conflict of that sort. But I do think that, and we are debating like Professor Kahl said, the worst possible scenario, which is a collapse of negotiations. And I think almost certainly all of us would agree that if there's a peaceful way to work out the nuclear issue, that would be the best for the global stability, global peace, and we are certainly hopeful for that.
I mean, the only thing I would add is that I think one can make a decent argument that the collapse of diplomacy blamed on the Americans, followed by a strike by the Americans that was viewed as internationally illegitimate, would set us up for a lot of political conflict in the world. And it would make it more difficult for us to keep Iran isolated. It would make it more difficult for us to hold the sanctions regime together. It may or may not make it more difficult for us to cooperate with some important countries in other areas. The notion that other powerful countries would use a U.S. strike on, frankly, on any other country as a justification for World War III with the United States, I find a bit, I find personally a little fanciful in the sense that we remain the world's preeminent military power with thousands of nuclear weapons and the ability to defend ourselves pretty well. So I think deterrence is likely to hold in terms of a global conflagration of retaliation against the United States. It would be the political conflict and the consequences, which would be potentially quite profound, that I would be more concerned about. Right over here, sir. Right, hand up.
Hi, Sam Berkman from J Street. I just had a question revolving more around the idea of the extension of negotiations and really surrounding the efficacy of current sanctions. I mean, there's been reports that the EU is growingly frustrated with their decrease in trade while the U.S. has seen an increase. How do you foresee us able to, if there is an extension, able to shore up EU support and maintain the current sanctions regime?
So I guess that's for me, since it was beyond the topic, right? Because you had to presume diplomacy fails, and this is so. Here's the question, the deadline for the joint plan of action is July 20th. What happens if it slips? Now, this could happen if the parties believe they're close. They may not even have to formally renew it, right? They just kind of keep talking for a couple weeks and seal the deal. Or maybe there is a formal renewal, and it's for a 3-month period or a 6-month period. The joint plan of action provides for that. It doesn't require an act of Congress or anything else. It just requires the parties to agree to it. I think there's a general sense that if it was extended by 3 or 6 months, things aren't going to fall apart in terms of the sanctions regime, which, by the way, has probably stuck more than some advocates, some critics of the interim agreement thought. I mean, if you actually go back, read the critiques of the Geneva Agreement, the Joint Plan of Action in November, all of these folks saying, oh, the Obama administration is saying it's $7 billion of relief. It's really going to be $20 or $30 billion of effective relief because all these countries are going to go rushing back to Iran. It hasn't happened, right? If anything, the relief has probably been less than was promised because people are so nervous that the logic of fear is still dominating the logic of greed in markets. I don't think that's going to collapse in another 6-month period. I do think if you get to January of 2015, so a year anniversary, then you start to have political inviolability on lots of levels. I think it's going to be very difficult in the United States to hold back folks who are not inclined towards diplomacy or who really want to ramp up pressure. I think that will be hard. I think in Iran's system, you will have a lot of voices to say Rouhani had his shot. He tried to make a bad deal with the great Satan, and he failed. It's time to us to take another path, resort to resistance, abandon the negotiations. That'll be something that they'll have to fend off. And then there's the international pressure of you have this diplomatic impasse, and companies are not being able to do business, and governments are being lobbied by those companies. And so I do think we might get to the point where technically you could continue to renew, but politically, at kind of these different levels, it would be very difficult to actually do it. Sir, right. And then the woman over here, please.
Thank you. I'm Professor Wayne Glass from the University of Southern California, here with a group of students from the West Coast for 6 weeks studying issues related to nuclear security. So thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here, and I think we were informed by your debate. Thank you for that. I'm sitting here after having had a career in Washington, in the Pentagon, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the State Department, and the Congress before I entered the classroom. And it was my concern during my career in Washington that I often encountered the syndrome which I call ready, shoot, aim. And as we talk about these issues and we discuss the potential outcomes of one option over another, you kind of implicitly explore the context in which those actions might be taken, which is to say, by defining the goals, U.S. foreign policy goals in the region with respect to the actors, both in the near term and the far term, before you consider the alternatives, I think that puts the whole debate into a more explicit context. So in my sort of one-man campaign, as I escaped the Beltway over the years, is to get the discussion to begin with an explicit discussion and consideration of what makes sense in terms of U.S. goals, both near-term, far-term, with respect to the actors, economic goals, military goals, financial goals, et cetera. So that's my comment, and feel free to respond. But
any of you have anything to say in response to that? Or?
I think a lot of this has been addressed previously, but I think the point of this debate was that neither option is a good one, and the point was sort of to engage in a thought experiment of what happens in either particular scenario. And I think in many ways the resolution predetermined the outcome of this debate, and that we decided that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon, but it presupposed that diplomacy would fail. I think in reality it's a lot more complicated, but there is a value in the process of engaging in that thought experiment, which I think this debate and academia and society should definitely do.
The one thing I would say, and then we'll have our last question and turn to the judges. If you go back to President Obama's speech at the UN General Assembly a few months back, he outlined 4 core interests that the United States continues to have in the Middle East. Right? One was to prevent any country from committing external aggression and dominating the region. That goes back to the Nixon and Carter doctrines. That's not new. The second is to maintain the free flow of energy resources to the global economy, which will remain vital for our economy even if we don't import a drop of oil from the Middle East. Again, long-standing bipartisan. Third, to prevent disrupt and deal with international terrorist organizations in the region that may threaten us or our allies. And fourth, to prevent the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction or their use. Those 4 are relatively uncontroversial national interests, and Iran is at the center of all of them. Right? It's not the only thing that's at the center of all of them, but it is a leading state sponsor of terrorism. It sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's tradable oil passes. That was a bit of the debate in here. There's obviously questions about its potential acquisition of nuclear weapons, and its hegemonic or revisionist ambitions in the region are also a threat to our allies. So I think in this case, I think the United States can be critiqued in its foreign policy in a million different ways in a million different areas. But actually on the Iran issue, I think you have seen a kind of classic, here are our objectives, here are our national interests, and here's a strategy that has an economic component, a diplomatic component, an intelligence component, a military component. You can quibble with how they've been implemented or the balance between them, but I think there actually is a strategy here, and inshallah, it'll produce a diplomatic, peaceful outcome. All right. Okay. Last question.
Thank you. This has been terrific. My name's Cornelia Weiss, and I'm not going to the issue that you all raised, but the pre-issue on that. And that is with regard to our negotiations. I'm wondering in terms of the Iranian thinking, not only in terms of the nuclear powers that are around it, but also looking at another historical context, and that is of Libya. It survived for many years by being belligerent against the U.S., and then when it acquiesced to the U.S., what happened? The U.S. turned on it, and so I wonder if that's part of their thinking, because that is a historical reality.
Yes. This goes to the question of what are Iran's motivations to seek these capabilities. I think actually most analysts agree that there's at least partly a defensive motivation. That is, they're surrounded by nuclear powers. They've been, in their minds, the victims of foreign aggression for a long time. They have a long-standing set of grievances with the United States, going back to the Mossadegh coup and then our support for the Shah. Their revolution was framed in many respects in opposition to us. Their revolutionary identity is framed in opposition to us. They don't trust us. They potentially fear us. They're also concerned about the Israelis. Their nuclear program accelerated in the 1980s in the midst of the Iran-Iraq war because they feared Saddam's use of weapons of mass destruction, which the world looked the other way with when he was using chemical weapons against Iranian cities, and they feared his nuclear program. So I think there's an argument to be made that they have a defensive motivation to do it. And by the way, they look at countries like North Korea that got the bomb and they're still around, and Libya that gave up the bomb and they're gone. On the other hand, there are at least elements within the Iranian system that appear to want these capabilities for more than just regime survival and actually want to use these capabilities to throw their weight around in the region. And I think it's important that there is no one Iran. There are factions in Iran, there's real politics in Iran, and frankly, these political factions don't agree on the utility of the nuclear program. And part of the diplomacy is to empower those voices within Iran that are more moderate on the nuclear question and want to be reintegrated into the world, and to disempower those voices who would like to use to develop those nuclear capabilities in a way that would undermine our interests and threaten our friends. And ultimately, the Iranians themselves, at least argue, would undermine their interests. I recommend reading bits and pieces of Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran's recent foreign affairs article, which he says that at the end of the day, this is like toward the end of the article, where he says the mere perception that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons actually makes Iran much less secure, because it encourages encirclement, it encourages it encourages an arms race in the region, and it could encourage a nuclear arms race in the region, and that undermines Iranian strength rather than supports it. So I don't know whether he believes what he says. I have no idea. But at the very least, that's a narrative that if the Iranians embrace politically can be a way out of this crisis, which is we never wanted nuclear weapons to begin with, there's a fatwa against them, and oh, by the way, pursuing them or even getting close to them is counter to our interests. So it is not a defeat for us to assure the world, is in fact in our security interest to do so. All right, so with that, thank you for your questions. And do we have like a, I don't know, somebody who's a representative of the Gottlieb? Reluctantly. So do we have can we bring a mic up here? None of this is, as I mentioned before you came in, it's just like the debaters are making arguments that they may or may not believe. The judges may be voting for arguments they may or may not believe. So, Mike.
Thank you for clarifying that. As often happens in debate rounds, for those of you not familiar, our resolution of the debate does not necessarily reflect our views of the substantive merits of particular arguments. And in this case, in this debate in particular, we unanimously thought that the affirmative won the debate. We thought that the negative throughout the course of the debate presented possibly more sophisticated arguments and arguments that we thought could carry the debate at the end of the day. But just the way the debate got put together in the last two speeches, we all thought that the affirmative prevailed. And we can talk about different arguments and how we resolved them, but that is our decision.
All right, so you can pigeonhole the judges, and if they stick around for, if some of them stick around for the reception and tap their brains a little bit more on that. I want to thank all of you for coming. I hope you found it interesting. I want to thank all the debaters for spending 3 days with us in Washington, the coaches for making this happen. And as I said at the outset, you know, one of our missions at CNAS is to groom the next generation of national security leaders. I think one way for us to do that is to forge deeper connections with the college debate community, where some of the brightest and smartest of our young people are exploring and tackling some of the most difficult questions, and I think that was in evidence today. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy the reception in the back. And let's give a round of applause for the debaters. And thanks to the judges, who all have busy lives that I'm sure some of them will have to rush back to almost immediately, but thank you so much for taking time to listen and make your decision.